So we are pleased now to be joined by Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome to the live stream, Jonathan.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you.
Great to be with you.
I think you are the first guest that I link in from the US directly.
I'm
Uh,
honored.
I already presented you in Norwegian to our Scandinavian viewers, but let me repeat that you are the Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Schanzer has previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the US Department of Treasury, and he has had research positions in other think tanks. The new book, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War, is his fourth book. So let's go straight into it. Why did you write this book?
Well, I watched the war, as I think most people did, as it appeared in the news during those 11 days in May. For me, it was a bit different, though, because I watched a lot of the conflict in Hebrew in the Israeli press. With smart TV, smartphone technology, obviously with social media, I was able to track it very closely. In fact, closer than the other three Gaza wars that we've seen over the years. And what I saw, and by the way, I should note, I also watched it in Arabic as well. And what I saw was that the editorial choices were just horrific, to, I think, put it mildly. I'm not talking about bias. I'm not talking about fake news. I'm talking about decisions that were being made at the highest levels within the editorial structures of the television stations and newspapers. And it was, for me, very frustrating, perhaps even a bit embarrassing, as I watched mistake after mistake being made. They missed so much of the important context, and in fact, often some of the important stories that took place during a war that I think will be viewed in retrospect as very consequential.
Yeah, yeah. This has been my work as well for the last 2 decades to expose the errors of the Norwegian media. So it's did you primarily criticize American media or also European media houses?
Well, I can't say I was watching the Norwegian media very
No, sure,
closely.
sure. But
uh,
English languages.
yes, all the English language reporting, but I think more importantly, a lot of the international news agencies, so
Mm,
Associated Press and Reuters and all of the major agencies that were reporting, what I think we saw was a tendency on the part of all of the reporters who were based in Israel and certainly their editors at home to frame this as just one more conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis. I think the implication was just simply, well, they hate each other so much that every few years we see a war erupt, and what are you going to do? And then from there, the criticism begins to come down heavily on Israel, that the casualties were lopsided, that that Israel was using disproportionate force, and I think the facts show a very different war. This was a
mm,
war that was carried out by proxy, by Iran and Turkey and Qatar. These are the primary sponsors of Hamas. And of
mm,
course, the lopsided nature of the war, I think is somewhat obvious, for the simple fact that Israel is a regional power in the Middle East. It
mm,
is a high-tech military, and Hamas made the fateful decision to begin to fire crude rockets at Israel with very little else to back it up. And Hamas has done this repeatedly. This is the fourth such war. There could have actually been many more, based on the fact that Israel does respond to these rocket attacks when it feels as if certain red lines have been crossed. But I think the point here is that Hamas knew exactly what it was getting into. It fights these wars knowing that it is going to be on the receiving end of a very surgical and overwhelming response from Israel every time it chooses to engage in a war along these lines. And so the media acted, I think, irresponsibly in framing this as just one more war in a string of many. This was the latest provocation by a proxy force acting on behalf of several other regional powers.
And what are those other regional powers except Iran?
Well, so Iran is the primary one. And of course,
Yep.
we didn't see a whole lot of discussion during the war here. I don't know how it was portrayed in Norway, but Iran barely got mentioned in the analysis that I saw here, despite the fact that the overwhelming number of rockets were provided by Iran. The funding for Hamas primarily comes from Iran, the training, the engineering, for the tunnels and for the rockets and for the drones, it all comes from Iran. But if you take your analysis to the next level in terms of looking at the other support that Hamas has received over the years, we see, for example, Qatar as a major financier of Hamas, Turkey as a financier and political and diplomatic patron for Hamas, and even a country like Malaysia, which we don't typically hear about, has in recent years become a significant jurisdiction for support to Hamas. And so none of these things really appeared in the headlines. Most of it was about the death toll, about the lopsided nature of the war that followed. But of course, Hamas could care less really about the lopsided nature of these wars. The goal for Hamas is to demonstrate to the Palestinian people and perhaps to the broader Muslim world that they are engaging in what they call resistance at any cost.
How would you say this last Gaza conflict was different than the previous ones?
Well, in many ways, it was very similar in the sense that Hamas fired rockets. Israel neutralized those rockets with Iron Dome. It was effective beyond 90 or perhaps even 95% in terms of neutralizing the rockets that were being fired into Israel. And then, of course, Israel neutralized the vast majority of Hamas targets that they had identified and received legal approval from their Ministry of Justice and from the Israel Defense Force. What was different, I think there were a few moments that I think demonstrated the difference of this battle from the others. One was the so-called Hamas metro system. This was a labyrinth of tunnels that Hamas had prepared by diverting tens of millions of dollars, perhaps even hundreds of millions of dollars worth of material that had been intended for the reconstruction of Gaza over the years. We're talking about cement and various metals that would reinforce structures. Instead, they were sent underground. And the goal in the creation of this metro system was to kill or kidnap as many Israeli soldiers as possible. Israel had excellent intelligence in advance of this war and was able to destroy a large portion of this tunnel system by surprise. It took Hamas by surprise. And so that was one moment that made this war very different. Perhaps another moment was Israel's destruction of a large apartment and office building. It's known as the Jala Tower. This happened right around the middle of the war, where Israel had determined that there was a Hamas office in this large building that was jamming the Iron Dome system. And of course, the implications of that are significant. If Hamas was able to effectively jam Iron Dome, it could have led to the deaths of thousands of people, both on the Israeli side and then in response. If the IDF felt the need to respond to such attacks, and you can imagine what that would do to the Gaza Strip and to the people of Gaza. So the Israelis destroyed the building, and they took quite a bit of heat for it internationally, because that was where the Associated Press and where Al Jazeera was operating in the Gaza Strip.
Mm.
Ultimately, Israel was vindicated. It showed the intelligence to the United States, and the United States verified that this was, in fact, a Hamas building. But this
Mhm.
was, I would say, a moment that struck me as unique in the history of these conflicts. This was, as I
Mm.
mentioned, the fourth of such conflict, and we'd never seen anything quite like that before.
Yeah.
Finally, I would probably note that the end of the conflict was very different. Um, at the end of the war, we heard that there was about 48 hours before an Egyptian brokered ceasefire would take effect. And it was at that moment that I noticed in the American press that the White House began to change its tone with regard to Israel. What was really remarkable about the war up until that ninth day was that President Joe Biden was giving Israel all of the support that it needed, and quite frankly, that I believe that it deserved, as it fought a brutal terrorist organization with some fairly nasty state sponsors. So Israel was doing what it was justified in doing. But the tone shifted with 48 hours left to go in the war. It was effectively a blank check that was handed to President Biden. And rather than to continue to voice support for Israel as he had, he began to criticize Israel. And in my view, this was an attempt to appease the group of congressmen here known as the Squad,
Mhm.
or perhaps now viewed as the Hamas caucus. These were legislators who were openly trying to weaken Israel during the course of the war. And it was very surprising, in fact, shocking to me to see the
Mm.
president of the United States trying to appease these radical leftist members of Congress when he knew, in fact, that the war was going to end. So there was quite a bit of drama throughout the war, but Israel, I think, did prevail. And it was, I think, an important message to send to all of Hamas's sponsors as well as to Hamas itself.
Mm. Before we talk regarding what recommendations you have for Israel in relations to Gaza, I wanted to mention an incident we had in Norway during this last war. So NRK is the Norwegian national broadcaster, and they, I think, 2 or 3 days out in the conflict, they made the title "The Worst Bombing I have experienced," and they had an interview with a Palestinian worker for a Norwegian NGO, and in the interview he said, and this is the exact quote: "I don't believe Israel's attack was meant to hurt civilians." And he say, we understand, and this is also an exact quote, "We understand that the attack was directed against security targets." Before I tell you anything more, would you like to guess what happened? Since you know the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Although, it might be worth noting that a very similar incident took place with regard to UNRWA.
Yeah, yeah,
If you're familiar, the
yeah,
so-called refugee agency for the Palestinians. We saw these terrible things being reported at the time. Afterwards, I believe he was the deputy director for the Gaza office, and UNRWA came out and
yeah,
validated Israel's approach and said that all of the strikes were surgical and that aid was still coming through to Gaza throughout the entire war. And in
yeah,
fact, he almost paid Israel a compliment for the way in which it conducted itself during the conflict.
yeah,
And of course, that didn't stop the criticism along the lines of what you just mentioned.
yeah,
And obviously, so the messaging was a bit muddled.
yeah. So what happened in this case was that we of course made an article and social media post about with these quotes saying that Israel is not attacking civilians, and then the next day the whole article was removed from the NRK site, and we were contacted by this Norwegian NGO asking to remove his name and his photo because he had been threatened on his life, and his family had been threatened on his life by the Hamas people or their thugs. But the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, they just silently deleted it. They never mentioned it. They never told their viewers to inform the Norwegian population how this totalitarian control of the Hamas controls all the information coming out from the area.
Remarkable. And again, similar to the UNRWA incident as well, because the official that I mentioned was also removed from the Gaza Strip. That he feared for his life, that he was concerned. I think the entire agency was concerned for his life, and so for that reason, he was removed from the Gaza Strip. So one gets a sense that you can only go so far in telling the truth in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. But Hamas is still in power, and what would be your recommendations for Israel to do to face the threat and to also help the civilian population in the area?
Well, there are a couple things to note here. One is that for Israel, there is really no interest in fighting in the Gaza Strip. This is a tactical threat to Israel. It is not a strategic threat. It's not one that ultimately threatens the population of Israel beyond these rockets that continue to fly. And of course, they're dangerous, but Iron Dome is able to neutralize them. So Israel I think it's important to note, has no interest in returning to war in the Gaza Strip. But there are things that I think can and should be done to minimize the threat moving forward. One is, of course, that the United States needs to continue to provide Iron Dome interceptors to Israel and perhaps increase their production. This will be important for Israel's long-term safety. And of course, Iron Dome will also be important for neutralizing threats coming out of Lebanon, or perhaps Syria, or perhaps Iran, or even Yemen, as these are all places where Iranian proxies are based, and they have every intention of doing exactly what Hamas has done in an attempt to destroy Israel. And so that will be something to watch. The other thing that I think is going to be important for the United States, and I think also for the entire international community, and that should include Norway, and that is that pressure needs to be brought to bear on Hamas's key funders and supporters. So again, there should be significant pressure on Iran, on Qatar, on Turkey and Malaysia. They should no longer be treated as legitimate actors, if they are in the first place, because of the support that they provide to a known terrorist organization such as Hamas. And this is unfortunately it's not what's happening, certainly with the Iran nuclear deal. The international community appears very eager to throw additional funds at Iran in remuneration for re-entering the Iran nuclear deal. This is a huge mistake. As we know, this will only lead to increased financing for Iran's terrorist budget, which will include Hamas. The treatment of Turkey as a NATO ally must cease so long as it continues to engage in this activity. Working with the Qataris as a legitimate actor internationally also must cease while this activity is going on. So this is, I think, these are the steps that I think should be taken. I don't have much hope that any of these policies are going to shift anytime soon. But if the goal is to minimize the conflict out of the Middle East, Hamas should feel isolated, and so should its patrons when these conflicts erupt.
Yeah. So where can Norwegian viewers or Danish, Swedish viewers get hold of your book?
It's available on Amazon. It's all done through Amazon services. It was a book produced by FDD, by my think tank, but we produced it through Amazon. So the goal was to get it out quickly. The book is still the first and only that I'm aware of about the conflict from May of last year. And my expectation is it will probably still be alone in this category for another few months. And so this should enable your readers to get up to speed on all of this, the background, and in fact, the day by day of the conflict, so that when these other books are produced, that readers will be armed with hopefully what they will consider to be better information.
Great. What is your next book?
I don't know yet, although I am thinking about one that looks at the Israel-China relationship, which of course has become very complicated in
Yeah.
recent months as the United States has escalated its great power competition with the Chinese Communist Party, and Israel is caught a bit in the middle of all of this. And so being able to unpack that complicated relationship could be my next project. I'm doing the research now, and I'll let you know in a few months.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They built a huge harbor in Haifa, for example.
They did, and that was obviously before a lot of the concerns that we hear from the United States now. That was before a lot of these concerns were being expressed. So Israel has some catching up to do in terms of aligning its policy to match that of the United States, but it must do
Yeah,
so without angering the world's second largest power.
yeah,
And that is no small feat for the Israelis to execute.
yeah. Do you have a few more minutes, or
Sure, sure.
maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Foundation for Defense of Democracies?
Absolutely. So we are a think tank in Washington. We are about 60 people, and we focus on everything from obviously the Palestinian-Israeli issue, but we cover Turkey, we cover China, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, cyber issues, Russia, everything that I think intersects with international security. You'll typically find us addressing it in some shape or form. We are nonpartisan, which means we are not affiliated with Democrats or Republicans. We work with both parties in an effort to try to guide American policymaking in a better direction. We believe that certain things are always true, that terrorism can never be justified, that there are a handful of Democratic allies that are worthy of America's defense, Israel being among them. A number of European and Scandinavian allies, I think, are also included in that list. But ultimately, we view this as a long struggle. And I think certainly in recent months, we have seen new challenges emerge, whether they be from China, from Russia, North Korea, certainly from Iran. These are all issues that must be tackled with wise policy. And we are often concerned that the wisest course of action is not chosen here in Washington, and that is precisely why we exist.
Yeah, um, sounds like worthy causes. Um, do you do you like? It will be a real challenge for Israel to navigate in the future when they need a working relationship with Moscow, and when it's so heated between Washington and Moscow, that this will be a big challenge. What is your comment to that?
Yeah, it's absolutely going to be a challenge for Israel. I think that a lot of people mistakenly describe the Russian-Israel relationship as an alliance. It is absolutely not an alliance. It is a professional working relationship that has evolved over time. Really, I would say that the most significant moment was the 2014 so-called Red Line debacle that occurred here, or maybe that was 2013, excuse me, where the United States had vowed to go into Syria if chemical weapons were being used. Ultimately, the United States did not do so. This was the Obama administration. But after multiple discussions and policy debates about what to do with regard to Syria, the United States elected to stay out. And that opened the door for Vladimir Putin to come in. And since then, he has established a significant military presence, but more importantly, the Russians now have air defense systems, the S-400 air defense systems, which means that whenever Israel has targets that it must strike, as Iran continues to try to smuggle weaponry by way of Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and to Lebanon, the Israelis have no choice but to deconflict with the Russians. And so a good working relationship has been absolutely necessary for Israel to defend itself. But it now finds itself in this very strange situation where the Russians are on the brink of war with Ukraine. The United States is trying to craft policy and to enlist its allies to work with the US. The Israelis have multiple priorities that they must juggle here. So it is a complicated issue for them, to put it mildly. But from what I can tell anyway, right now, the Israelis continue to handle themselves as well as can be expected. So they continue to deconflict with the Russians, but also to coordinate closely with the Biden administration.
There is a question from a viewer. Is China positive to Israel in general?
Well, it is and it isn't. It's a very, this is why I think I may write a book on this ultimately. On the one hand, the Chinese account for something like $17 billion in trade with the Israelis. And this is, of course, very important for Israel's economy to thrive. It's a small country. $17 billion is not small change from Israel's perspective. And the Chinese we see investing in, some of the infrastructure projects that Israel needs. Israel is a country where the infrastructure has really gone, I think, unaddressed for quite some time. And so they need people to refurbish their highways and bridges and roads. And when the Chinese come in, and by the way, in ports and underground metro systems as well. And so when the Chinese come in to help, it's usually done for pennies on the dollar compared to U.S. counterparts, U.S. companies or other companies from around the world that may have bid on those projects. So this is the good news, is that China is there and willing to work with Israel to support its economy. The downside, of course, is that the Chinese are prolific intellectual property thieves. They are constantly trying to steal technology that can be used for military applications. And the Israelis have been targeted. There's no question about it that Israel is known as the startup nation for its prowess in the high-tech space, and the Chinese are targeting Israel in that way. So it's forcing the Israelis right now to address their bureaucratic and national security approaches to Chinese investment. What they want to do is to balance the positives with regard to China, while also addressing the negatives as being raised by the United States. So it's a mixed picture, a mixed bag, if you will. And again, the Israelis have, I think, quite a number of challenges that await them as they work to align their policy with the United States, which of course remains their most important partner, their most important friend in the world. And so they cannot ignore the concerns of the US, nor should they.
Final question regarding Israel's democracy. Like tomorrow, Amnesty International will present a report accusing Israel of apartheid. And many people are saying that Israel can't be a democracy since it's a Jewish state. What are your comments to this?
Well, Amnesty is unfortunately no longer, in my view, a legitimate NGO in the human rights space. I think it has succumbed to pressure from activists. I don't believe that they come at the Palestinian-Israeli issue with really any credibility any longer, and that's a shame, because we see this with other NGOs as well. Human Rights Watch being another big one that has fallen quite far. At the end of the day, one has to look at the lives of the Arab Israeli citizens in Israel. One cannot call that apartheid when one looks at the fact that you can be a member of Knesset. In fact, we see Arab parties that are part of the ruling coalition right now, that they're actively engaged in policy making at the highest levels. Whether and by the way, it goes well beyond that. I mean, there's a police chief who's an Arab Israeli who's just recently stepped down. But we see Arab Israelis throughout the police. We see Arab Israelis in the Supreme Court. There is really no question about it that Arab Israelis, while they have their challenges, societal challenges that I think no one would deny, they are integrated. Apartheid is absolutely the wrong word to use. It is actually an egregious word to use. And then if we want to take a look at the ongoing conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis, and looking at Israel's security policies there, the idea that this is anything more than a historical and political conflict, that somehow race has found its way into it, I think is absolutely libel against the Jewish state. Israel has been fighting for its own survival since before 1948, and some of its primary foes over the years have been the Palestinians themselves. Terrorism has remained a core issue, a core security problem for Israel over the years. And so addressing that, whether by security barriers or by tighter restrictions on who is able to enter Israel from the West Bank, or in fact the Gaza Strip, this is of course Israel's sovereign right. So there are, I think, huge problems with the analysis of Amnesty International, but I think again, it's really at this point a question of credibility. It's quite clear that they have succumbed to a narrative, and I think probably to the pressure of certain activists that ultimately have little interest in solving these problems, but rather blaming Israel for them.
Yeah, absolutely. They are going full anti-Semites, sadly. Jonathan, thanks a lot for joining us.
My pleasure.
Congratulations with your book, and all the best with the sale.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, bye.
Okay, all the best.
Jag har fått frågan, varför övertalade du MIF Norge att starta MIF Sverige? Om vi i Sverige ska kunna bemöta den starkt ensidiga, förvrängda